This is the fifth video in a series showing how to set up, configure, test, and debug the MVS Toolkit. In this video, we'll cover how to use the Toolkit Client IDE to configure web service operations and define dynamic arrays. Let's create a subroutine operation for a SOAP web service. If you haven't already done so, launch the IDE and create a SOAP web service. And this time, after clicking yes to finalize the creation of the web service, you'll be presented with a Create a Web Service Operation dialog. If you're adding a web service operation to an existing web service, simply right-click on the web service and select Create Web Service Operation. Either way, do the same stuff you did to select the MV server and account. And if this is your first operation or resource, remember to set up the connection pool as appropriate. Next, you'll be presented the Select a Web Service Operation Type dialog. Notice this time it's only one radio button group. Click Catalog Subroutine and click Next. Now you're presented the Select the Catalog Subroutine dialog. As before, enter the name of the web service resource that will appear in the URL. Now enter the name of the subroutine in the subroutine text box and press the Tab key. The system will now read the arguments defined in the subroutine and list them in the box below the subroutine name. Note that there is a List button to the right of the subroutine name dropdown. It can present you with a list of catalog subroutines in the account, but be careful. If there are only a few subroutines, it will still take a long time to populate and present the list. If there are hundreds of catalog subroutines, you'll be sitting there for nearly an hour and might even crash the IDE. I highly recommend that you stay away from the List button. When the subroutine arguments box is populated, you'll see that there is a line for each argument in the subroutine's first line. In the example, the arguments are name and response. By default, the last argument is defined as an output argument and all the rest are defined as input arguments. Also by default, the names are exactly as coded in the subroutine statement and all arguments are treated as simple strings. These can all be manipulated as follows. Please ignore the Add and Delete buttons. Highlight the desired line in the dialog and press the Edit button. Here's the argument definition dialog. Leave the argument number text box alone. You can use the name text box to change the name of the argument if desired. This is particularly useful for changing all uppercase variable names to lowercase so that the modern world doesn't think the D3 programmer is shouting at them. The usage dropdown is used to define whether the argument is used to pass data to the subroutine or for the subroutine to pass data back to the requester, or both. The binding mode dropdown lets you define if the argument is a simple string or a dynamic array. More on that later. Finally, the data type dropdown lets you define if the argument is a string, a date, a time, an integer, or a floating point number. Once you're done here, click OK to return to the subroutine definition dialog. When you're done there, click Finish. Once you've defined the subroutine resource, you'll need to create dynamic array maps for any arguments that are dynamic arrays and not simple variables. To do this, in the IDE's upper left panel, right-click on the subroutine resource's name and click Create Dynamic Array. A small dynamic array definition dialog will pop up. Enter a name for the dynamic array in the name text box and click OK. Now you see a dialog allowing you to add dynamic array elements. Press the Add button to add a line. You are now presented with the field definition dialog. Enter a name for the attribute you are defining in the name text box. Leave the attribute text box alone for now. The data type dropdown functions exactly the same as the subroutine argument definition dialog. The type dropdown allows you to select whether the attribute is single-valued, multi-valued, or multi-sub-valued. Once you're done defining the attribute, click OK. Repeat this process for all of the elements in the passed or returned dynamic array. Here's an example of a completed dynamic array with a mixture of data types and single and multi-values. Once you've finished the dynamic array definition, you'll need to add it to the subroutine definition. In the upper left panel, double-click on the web service resource to bring up the Edit dialog. Edit the subroutine argument in question and use the binding mode drop-down to change from simple to dynamic array. Another text box drop down will appear that you can use to assign the new dynamic array definition to that argument. When you're done, click the Save icon above the upper left IDE panel or X out of the definition and click Yes to save. In the next video, we'll talk testing the web services, dropping web services, exporting and importing web services. If you have any questions about any of the content we've covered so far, please contact Rocket D3 support.